It's a pleasure welcoming you back after lunch, and it's also a very great pleasure for me to introduce you to the youngest speaker today, which has come all the way from Madrid, and we're very pleased that you did that. So Ernesto Panadero, he's a senior researcher and works at the research at the Developmental and Educational Psychology Department at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. I should probably have spoken to you about this, how to pronounce it. Yeah, and he's also an honorary professor at the Center for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning in Deakin University in Australia. And one of the things which really impressed me is that in 2017, he received the Eric Decourt Award given at a big early conference because he was seen to be the most promising early career European researcher in the field of learning and instruction. And that is also one of the reasons why I was very pleased when the editorial board approved and we invited him, and you agreed to be our new executive editor. So he is our last addition to our journal. In 2016, Ernesto created the Education Regulated Learning and Assessment research groups that he led. And additionally, Ernesto was coordinator of the early SIG group of assessment and evaluation, who many of you know. And he's also a member of the Continental Europe team at the Assessment for Learning International Network. His research interest is twofold. First, the understanding and promotion of self-regulated learning at the individual level, and socially shared regulated learning at the collaborative learning level. And second, the relationship between self-regulated learning and the use of formative assessment, self-assessment and peer assessment. Additionally, his research on assessment explores the psychological correlates of self and peer assessment, interpersonal and social variables. So I did ask Ernesto to give his reflections and also a presentation where he perhaps look a little bit into what is next. Because after this morning, when we had all these good reflections about where we're coming from, and we've also been challenged by our lead editor, Foundation, where do we go next? And one of my suggestions is we do look into different research areas and see also the links between them, for instance, such as assessment for learning, formative assessment, and self-regulation. So, Ernesto Panadero, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want you to ask to please let this sink in. Because we have achieved a lot, but just as Dylan was saying before, there is still a lot to investigate. And the more we get into understanding how formative assessment works, the more questions are popping up all the time. So this is really important to have in mind. While doing this exercise of letting this sink in, I want you to think about this. We, of course, know what Paul and Dylan were up to. They were publishing a review, having a good time in the library. But, for example, I'm going to talk about my personal experience. That was one of the worst years in my life. What happened is, in that particular year, I was actually in this academic year, which is the last one from secondary education, in which you get prepared for the entry exam level to the university. So the whole academic year was about getting prepared for a really big exam at the end of that year. As you can imagine, I was not really motivated for learning at that time. I really wanted to pass the exam, and the teachers were really stressing out all the time how important this exam was. But I also have another interesting story, and it comes from my childhood. I was born in a, really working type of neighborhood in Madrid, and my parents decided that they wanted to actually invest in my future. So they put me in this kind of innovative school from the 6 months until I was 12. And during all that time, I didn't even perform a single exam. Everything in that school was about assessment for learning and formative assessment. And this happened in the late 80s, and so from the early 80s until the early 90s. And the conclusion here, I think, is that formative assessment is all about good instruction. If we have good teachers who actually reflect about their learning goals and how they have to implement and design the instructional setting, we actually usually have really good assessment. which aligns with formative assessment goals. Now, that is not to say, because that's not what I'm trying to say, that Black and Wiliam IPA is not important. It is crucial for us. It has put together a field, and it has allowed us to speak the same language, not only as a scholar, but also when we speak to teachers, and when we speak to policymakers, and so forth. We now also have our own conferences, and people even from the ETS had hired, for example, Dylan, because they wanted a formative guide assessment. So we have to consider that a lot has been achieved because of this review, and we have to continue moving the field forward. So what about the future? And something that I found really ironic, if you allow me a joke, is that you will call in a Spaniard to talk about the future of research, knowing how the situation of research and development is in the country, that we don't invest much. But hopefully I will have some things to say about this. I think I have to talk a little bit about my background so that you can actually frame what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm coming from a faculty of psychology. So I was, up to a point, trained by the evil people from the summative version. So you have to keep this in mind. And I also wanted to think that because I'm coming from educational psychology, I actually publish a lot in educational psychology. So I'm going to be referring to a lot of publications that are actually in those type of journals, even though I think I am fairly knowledgeable of what has been publishing in education and assessment journals. So what about the future? This has been popping up in the other presentations. I thought I might have to spend 5-10 minutes talking about this. I don't think I need anymore. And I'm really glad that this happened, because this actually shows that we have changed the sieve and we are coming to a different understanding of how to put these two together. I think, for example, all the presentation by Dylan, this was central. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But just a thought. I think that this might be actually a reflection of the stage in which formative assessment is. At the beginning of every discipline or new research area, we want to distinguish ourselves from other existing research areas. And probably at that time, there was a huge push to actually differentiate formative assessment from summative assessment. And now what I see is people from both areas coming together and putting together these ideas to actually try to design better assessment tools and to create better formative assessment settings. So I'm really glad that we are at this stage at the moment. I'm going to talk about 4 areas for the future. These are not the only ones, but there is only so much that I can cover in the time. And you will find them aligned with the review by Paul and Peter. So we have a teacher, teachers in general. We have pre-assessment. We have self-assessment. And we have self-regulated learning, or SRL, as I'm going to be saying it for now. And I'm going to be talking about each of them in particular. So let's start with the teachers. So, why are teachers important for formative assessment? If we consider what we know from the review, we usually talk about 3 different agents when it comes to formative assessment: the teacher, the peer, and the self. So teachers are central because they are actually the main agents providing feedback in the classroom, but also because they create and promote the different instructional settings for formative assessment to happen. So we have to have this clear in our mind. But something that we also need to consider is that teachers are usually under summative constraints. For example, in secondary education in Spain, teachers have to be reporting to the high school every other month about the development of the students in summative terms. So we have to be aware of what are these type of constraints that they have before we can actually promote them and try to train them to implement formative assessment, because sometimes we can create tensions that are difficult for them to solve. Back in 2012, we have a number of questions about formative assessment, myself and some colleagues, and we decided let's try to figure it out how formative assessment practices look in different educational levels across Spain. So what we did is we put together a survey, and we were able to capture or collect data from 1,500 teachers in Spain across primary, secondary, and higher education. And I'm going to be showing the results or the main predictors of the use of self and peer assessment. And then we will extract some conclusions about this. Now, these are the main predictors that we found for the use of self-assessment in Spain in the classrooms. The three main ones is that the teachers should have had positive previous experience in the implementation of self-assessment. They should have knowledge about the advantages of using self-assessment, and they should have participated in assessment training about this particular topic. Looking at the picture that comes from the peer assessment study, we found pretty much similar results. So teachers need to have knowledge about the advantages of using peer assessment, they have to have previous experience, and they have to have participated in training. And there are two main conclusions that we extracted from these two studies. It is obvious, but still I think it's remarkable that we have to have this really clear. For teachers to use formative assessment, we have to train them and we have to allow them to have experience and practice with their own implementation of self and peer assessment. It's a really, really difficult business to implement peer and self-assessment in the classroom. And a lot of teachers actually, they just give it as a tryout. So I'm going to try one time, and it's usually a mess, and then they decided, I'm not going to try again. So we have to train them then and give this idea that it is actually an approach, an ability that can be developed over time. And something that is even more interesting, and you all know this, but still I think it's important to mention, is that teaching experience was not a significant predictor. So we cannot expect teachers, just because they have been in the profession for a really long time, to start actually implementing self and peer assessment. Now let's go to the comparison, because I think this is also really interesting. So we have primary, secondary, and higher education teachers. And our main was to explore in which educational level more formative assessment practices were happening. And let's play a little game here. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand for the ones that think that it was the higher education level teachers, the ones that actually implemented more formative assessment practices. No one? Secondary education teachers? Some hesitating hands. Primary education teachers? You got it right. My goodness. Yeah, that's basically what we found. And even if we compare the university teacher against the secondary education one, secondary education teachers were doing actually better than the university ones. Just the hypothesis of what happened there is that primary teachers in Spain actually have more pedagogical training. But something that is also key, they have a curriculum that actually emphasizes the importance of learning to learn, and how important it is that assessment should be about providing feedback to the students about this particular competence. So, what are the main conclusions when we have to look to the future of teachers and the role in formative assessment? This has been also popping up throughout the different presentations, professional development. And you find many papers who out there have seemed to find the cure for the teacher lack of knowledge about formative assessment, and whether we need to do that in pre-service, in service, and so forth. I really think we need to change our approach. I think it is crucial that we train teachers during their university years, so in the pre-service phase, to actually know what is formative assessment. We need to provide them with tools to design better assessment instruments. But we have to approach this as a professional development, long career span type of approach, in which we actually consider that teachers develop their identity throughout their career. And so it happens when it comes to the knowledge about assessment. So we have to be maybe a little bit less ambitious about really short-term interventions, and we need to actually try to do more long-term and more expanded type of interventions. And the second thing that has been also key for this particular journal, you will have been talking about curriculum, is that teachers need support from colleagues, from parents, from policymakers, and from curriculum. We have to provide a space for formative assessment to happen within the classrooms. And I really like this particular paper by Gavin Brown, and Louis Harris published in 2014 in Frontiers in, I don't remember right now, Frontiers in Learning, I will tell you later, in which they are actually making kind of a political even paper in which they claim that we need to have a curriculum for self-assessment. Self-assessment needs to be the key competence that students need to develop in the classroom. And something that we can be really proud about is that we are doing, I would say, an excellent job in disentangling what are the effects of teacher feedback and how to provide better teacher feedback to the students. And we have plenty of really excellent researchers working in this area. For example, you have Naomi Winston here working in the UK. You have people like David Bao in Australia, David Carles in Hong Kong, you name it. So I think we have to continue with that track of work. Now let's talk a little bit about peer assessment. What is peer assessment? Anyone dares to give a definition? All right. So peer assessment is about putting a peer assessing each other, right? Pretty much that's it. Let's see if that's the case. So I guess you are familiar with Kate Toppin's work. He's probably one of the best peer assessment scholars that there have been. In this paper in 1998, he proposed a constellation based on 17 different features that peer assessment can actually have. Now, look at all those features. It's quite amazing, right? But I think he actually got it right. All these features are important when we are implementing peer assessment. And the presence or absence of some of these features is going to have an impact on the effects that the peer assessment is going to have in our students. So this is so important. And what happened is in 2010, there was a follow-up. And in this paper, what they did is they clusterized these 17 categories, and they actually add 3 more. And even further. In the dissertation by Nanim Valjenid in 2012, she presented this type of taxonomy on, so to speak, peer assessment practices. So there are 5 of them. If this wasn't enough, Jan-Willem Strybos, which is also a really salient researcher in peer assessment, is working on a new constellation. So this is really important. We have a wide range of practices that can be called peer assessment, ranging from extremely summative to extremely formative, so to speak. I know this could be problematic for some, but I think something that is really interesting is that teachers are more clever than we are. Teachers do not actually care so much about the labels, but they actually explore whether different practices and different features of peer assessment work better in the classroom. And I don't think we are yet doing our job as researchers, because I think what we have to give these teachers is more precise guidelines on when and how peer assessment works. And for that, we actually need to start paying attention at the constellation, for example, from Toppin. So is it better if peer assessment is anonymous? Is it not? Is it better if peer assessment actually counts towards a grade? We don't know yet. So these are the type of questions that I think we need to be asking ourselves in a way to provide these information to the teacher. When I look at what is out there in terms of peer assessment, and this is mostly my personal view, you might not agree, but I have seen 4 main lines of research. We have a strong line of research, which is summative peer assessment, based on whether a peer is able to accurately give a grade to a peer, another student. Okay, and yeah, we know that students, if they are giving training, if they are training, and they actually provide them with tools and we give them practice, they can be fairly accurate. Now, when it comes to formative, does actually peer assessment has an impact on learning? Yeah, we have some reviews And yes, peer assessment can have an effect on learning. And we just published a chapter in a handbook of instructional feedback in which we were actually exploring the main reasons why peer assessment might actually influencing learning. There is a large proportion of studies which just look at students' perceptions about peer assessment. My recommendation is that we need to stop doing this type of research because it is repeating, it has been repeating for a long time, and we have to include new variables in a way for it to actually add something new to the field. And for me the key is the fourth one, and it's the one I'm going to be stopping for a minute to talk a little bit more. So, interpersonal variables. Why is it important that we explore how different interpersonal variables and human and social influence peer assessment? Well, because peer assessment is about social and interpersonal actions. And if we look back to 2009, when Nanit Banjanit actually put together that review, she only found 4 papers exploring this issue. So what happened is, 2012, Gavin and Luis asked me to put together a chapter about this particular topic. And it was really challenging, I have to say, but I think I learned a lot from this experience. Because, surprisingly, from 2009 up until now, this has become a really hot topic in formative assessment. A lot of researchers are actually asking themselves what happens when you put students to assess one another. And I was able to identify 3 main themes. Interindividual factors, such as motivation, emotion, interpersonal factors, friendship, social aspects, and cognitive aspects. And this is the main conclusion that I reached, and I'm going to let you read on your own. So yeah, in this particular case, and this has to be taken with care because the available research out there is still limited, seems like formative practices of peer assessment in the classroom are doing a better job when it comes to interpersonal factors. Things like, are students motivated to do peer assessment? Well, it seems like they are more motivated if they have opportunities to interact with one another, and if it is actually peer feedback, mainly the message, not so much peer scoring. So I think this is a key aspect to consider when we are talking about future lines of research. So I would recommend that we continue this line. We need more research on psychological variables and what happens in terms of interpersonal variables. We need to start using the constellation by topping. This is really important. Not only to create new research or new lines of research, but if we are still conducting more traditional research, we need to report really precisely how our peer assessment intervention looks like. And to do that, we could use the 17 categories by topping. That would really help the other researchers in the field. If we want to continue working on peer assessment scoring accuracy, that's okay, but I think we really need to change the shift and start playing a little bit with the different experimental variables and experimental design. And we need to start looking at other fields, like for example medicine. They are really doing an extraordinary work when it comes to peer assessment. And this is a quite touchy topic, anonymity. Hopefully this will pop up in the discussion later on. But anonymity has been claimed by some people as something that we really need to implement when it comes to peer assessment. And I don't know yet if that's the main message that we should be taking. I'm working on a review at the moment with a colleague on what we know on anonymity, but we are really in the initial stages of the review, so I cannot really provide the conclusions yet. How are we doing so far? It's time for self-assessment. I know this was actually a great time to put me in the program because this is the napping time. So I'm going to ask you, all of you, to stand up for a second. Do this with your arms. Thank you, that should do the trick. Now you can go back to napping time. So self-assessment. And I have been, this is the area that I have been working the most. It is lovely, isn't it? It is lovely because we know it is a really tricky business, and we still ask our students to self-assess. Are we doing it right? That's a key question. And I guess you are quite familiar with the Dunning and Kruger effect. No?
No.
Okay. I was ready for this, so. That is the Dunning-Kruger effect. All right? But something that they also found, and is less known, is that there is also this effect. When I look at the main lines of self-assessment in education, you can see things were running a little bit parallel to peer assessment. We have summative approaches, so are students accurate when they have to provide their own grade when compared to the one the teacher will give them? Are students learning from doing self-assessment? And I think that meta-analysis from Gavin Brown and Louise Harry actually nails it. And there has been a large proportion of studies lately about what are the effects of self-assessment on self-regulated learning. But we're going to be talking about this in the next block. For this particular section, when I was thinking about the future, my homework was already done, because we published this last year. And as you can see, well, we really like pompous titles for our papers. The future of student self-assessment, a review of known, unknowns, and potential direction. And we mostly talk here about 5 lines of research, so I'm going to just present them briefly. Do you remember that I was talking about peer assessment and I present all those different constellations? Well, guess what happened with self-assessment? Since like researchers, we are not able to put together a clear definition of self-assessment. And what we found out here are 5 different typologies on what self-assessment might look like. And I have to say, none of them actually nails it. And one of them is mine. So this is something that we need to continue working on. A second aspect that we mentioned in that review, and that is crucial, is it really that important if students are actually able to guess their own grade when compared to the teachers? And what we find out is, or this idea that we want to put forward, and we are not the first ones, is that what is more important is actually is the type of feedback, qualitative feedback, that a student will give to himself. Is that the same one that a teacher will give to them? Are they able to find their strengths and weaknesses in their performance? That is more important than having students to actually guess the self-score. Another aspect that is crucial is, and I have already mentioned about this effect, Dunning and Kruger, is that we need to approach self-assessment with this type of developmental approach in mind. So we ask students who had not the opportunity of doing self-assessment in their life to self-assess in a task that they are performing for the first time. And we want them to be accurate. Yeah, right? Do you remember the last time you tried something for the first time? I'm trying to know how to make my own bread. I don't know if any of you knows what my surname stands for in Spanish?
Bread maker?
Bread maker, that's it. I really suck at doing bread. And I have been trying for the last 2 years. And I don't know, I mean, at the end, at least you get to taste the bread, but what I'm trying to do right now is to look for a teacher. So we have to consider this. When we are asking students to self-assess, we have to allow them to practice. And we have to allow them to have some expertise in the task before we ask them to self-assess accurately, because it's extremely complicated. Curriculum, I have talked about this already. We have to have a curriculum that actually enables this. And the last one is that in educational research, we have not actually paid enough attention about how the effects of different students' profiles on self-assessment. And this is something that we really need to start doing. And now, up for the last block. Let's talk a little bit about this strange thing called self-regulated learning. Would you mind raising your hands? How many of you are familiar with this concept? Wow, that's really good. And I think there is a reason for this. I think this is probably on the top 3 hot topics on educational psychology for the last 20 years. And this is because it provides a really powerful framework on how to understand how students actually learn. This is the most cited definition by Zimmerman. And what self-regulated learning does really well is putting together a number of different strategies. They could be cognitive, metacognitive, motivational, emotional, and provides that type of framework that we can actually interpret what is happening in terms of the student learning. This is how Zimmerman model looked like. This is a really simplified version because I don't have the time to actually go into it, but we have 3 different phases. Without getting into much detail, students are supposed to go through these phases when they are performing a task. And if you are really into this topic, I published last year this review, which is getting some traction in the SRL field, in which I compared 6 different SRL models, and I provide some future directions for where to next with this research also. More importantly, why do we want to anchor formative assessment to SRL? And Dylan was mentioning this really nicely in his box table, right, with the 5 spots. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some aspects that I also consider important. I really think SRL is our gate, our entrance to psychological research. And I think we really want to get there because if we actually collaborate more with psychology and learning sciences, we are going to get deeper insights into how formative assessment is making a difference in the students' learning. And that was just what Joanne was mentioning. It also aligns really well with this idea of a student agency, which also formative assessment is trying to increase. Most importantly, SRL scholars need us, and they don't know it yet. So we have to go out there and tell them. And the reason is really simple. People usually consider and conceptualize SRL as all the positive things that happen in the classroom when students are actually performing strategies. But that is not the case. Because the key is SRL can also happen when students are motivated and have performance and avoidance goals. And as we know, we as teachers provide different classroom climates. And these climates are mostly influenced by the assessment practices that we have in our classroom. The way we give them feedback, if we are implementing assessment, exam, and so forth. So assessment is actually a really powerful tool to promote SRL happening in the classroom. Self and peer assessment are crucial for this. This relationship between SRL and formative assessment is so important that we have one of our key papers in formative assessment talk about it, but I should have done this otherwise. Try not to look in this area, okay? Just try to find out if you are able to guess what the model is just from the picture. Does it ring a bell? Yeah? So this is one of our most cited papers in formative assessment. The one that David Nichol and McFarlane did put together. And there are many reasons why this is so important. Now, this is a little bit outdated. We are working at the moment in a new one, which is actually putting together 3 different SRL models and how anchoring assessment practices to those models are actually giving us insights into how students learn and how we can promote learning strategies based on our assessment practices. What we know about, in terms of empirical research, about the relationship between formative assessment and self-regulated learning. And I'm sorry because Mary, just before starting this morning, she told me, are you going to be presenting your research? And I said, no, I try to approach it more like, a general context, but I'm putting a lot of my stuff up here, and I'm really sorry because this might look like a self-promotion presentation. But it just happened that we published this paper And just by reading the title, you can actually see that it's quite convenient that we publish this for this particular time. So what he did, Susan and myself did, is we explored what are the empirical evidence about the relationship between SRL and formative assessment. And we came up with this beautiful, beautiful figure in which we identified 3 different stages. We have the early years, which we have the work by, for example, Crooks, Salder, of course, Paul and Dylan, Black and Wiliam, etc. These authors were already mentioning how important learning strategies were, and even Paul and Dylan mentioned a couple of times self-regulated learning in the paper. But back in the late 90s, SRL was not so developed yet. The middle years come, and the relationship between SRL and formative assessment, they became more apparent. And people start talking more and more about this, especially when it comes to theoretical papers. So we have papers, for example, by Paris and Paris, which are coming from the SRL field, or we have the work by Susan Brookhart, and the reviews of feedback effects by Hattie and Timperley and Schutter. And this was mostly theoretical yet, but a large body of primary empirical research was building up in the background. Now, the current phase that we are going, and all of these are, most of them in the present time, are empirical reviews or meta-analysis. That much is what we know at the moment about formative assessment and SRL. And we really need to go out there and tell, well, we know a lot already about how our assessment practices are influencing the students' learning. So I guess we need to read some of those papers or read the review as a kind of a map if you are interested in the topic. In this review, we find out 2 main conclusions. There are 2 main lines of work. One, and the first line of work, is about actually this idea of co-regulation. So we have one student, and we as teacher or a peer can actually regulate that student to become more self-regulated himself. We are doing this via teacher assessment and peer assessment. There is a second line of work which belongs to self-assessment, and how through implementing self-assessment in the classroom, we are actually promoting self-regulated learning. And this is also a moment to take proud of being in the assessment field, because we are doing, I think, a way better job that self-regulated learning scholars are doing. We really need to tell them, hey, this is important. You should pay attention to this. Because what I see in most learning sciences conferences is that a lot of educational psychologists are actually talking about the same things that we are doing, but they don't frame them as assessment. And there is a lot of research which happen in experimental settings, laboratory settings, which are just self-assessment interventions, but because they don't have this other bigger framework, they don't frame it that way. So we have to go out there and tell, no, this is really interesting, but we approach it like this. Okay? And just lastly, let me talk a little bit about those 2 lines of work. So co-regulation from teacher assessment. We know already from the reviews on feedback effects, especially the one by Hattie and Timperley, that the way we give feedback, it has an impact on students' self-regulated learning and learning strategies. If you remember Hattie's model, they are talking about 4 different levels at which we can provide feedback. There is one particular one which is self-regulation model. So we can see it already. Luckily enough, the French-speaking scholars have been doing their job for plenty of years, as you know from the, I'm going to try to pronounce his name, Perranu, 98. Because scholars from France, Switzerland, and Canada were actually putting these ideas all together. Unfortunately, they were putting this in French. So there is a lot of digging into that literature, but I think we are keeping up at the moment with the English-speaking scholars. Regardless of this, we need more empirical evidence about this. And this is really easy to do. I mean, if you are implementing any type of intervention when it comes to teacher feedback, you can just actually start putting SRL as one of your dependent variables, and you will be already aiming for this type of research. So when we ask students to assess each other, that is another type of co-regulation, right? So they give feedback to each other, they can actually teach each other how to perform the task, how they regulate the task to do it. Well, we don't have any type of empirical evidence out there. We need to start doing this. Now, when it comes to the last piece, how self-assessment influences self-regulated learning, we know, I would say, fairly amount of chunk. Let's put it that way. I'm sorry, this is going to be a moment for self-promotion again, but we just published this meta-analysis in Educational Research Review. We found that just really simple interventions, just asking the students to self-assess, this actually has an impact in their learning strategies. I really want to emphasize the effort size for self-efficacy, which happened to be in this meta-analysis of 0.73. Just asking students to self-assess, it really boosts their self-efficacy. Summing up the future lines of research for SRL. We need more empirical evidence on co-regulation. We need to put together SRL models and formative assessment. We need more fine-grained research and experimental research. And we need to start looking at more for psychological and social formative effects on SRL. How are we doing? Shall I try to summarize everything? I make it really easy. So if you want to take a picture, this is the moment, okay? Okay, so this is what I said. Teachers, we need to approach professional development more as a career span mindset. We need to support them in every way possible for them to have the framework and the space to actually implement formative assessment in the classroom. And we need to continue the excellent research is being performed on feedback effects and how to give better feedbacks from the teacher's point of view. Pre-assessment. We need to start looking at the interpersonal variables, start using the constellation by Topium, looking at other fields, be careful what is going to happen with anonymity. And if we want to conduct all research, like if we want to focus on peer scoring accuracy, that's okay. But let's try to do it with new variables, so we actually learn more insights into how to do this better. And this also applies for self-scoring accuracy. When it comes to self-assessment, these are the four main ideas. Shifting from scoring accuracy to content accuracy, having a developmental approach in mind, so students actually need practice to develop their self-efficacy ability, having the space in the curriculum for this to occur in the classroom, and considering different students. And regulated learning, I just mentioned them, so I'm not going to repeat that. Two last slides. I don't do this alone, and I want to show you briefly the beautiful faces of my research team, which you can see there in Madrid. We have a really beautiful campus, and you are welcome anytime. And I want to leave you with this message. So I really encourage you to think that in 20 years, we need to be back. And if you invite me, I will take all the things that I say here and see how much we have achieved. So see you in 20 years, I guess.